They had spent $40,000 on therapy, 3 therapists over 8 years. They had done the Gottman method, that's a structured approach to couples work, very well researched, very thorough. They had done something called emotionally focused therapy. They had done a full year of weekend intensives, the kind where you drive to a retreat center on a Friday evening and come home Sunday night, wrung out and quietly hopeful. Both of them had also been in individual therapy, on and off, for close to a decade each. Robert and Annette had done the work, all of it, and they were sitting on my couch in their mid-50s, 28 years into a marriage, and telling me that their problem was that they just don't communicate well anymore. I was 10 minutes into our first session when I saw it. Not what they told me was the problem, what was actually happening right there in the room. And I want to tell you about it. Because if you are in a marriage or any long relationship where you keep working on it and working on it, keep trying the tools, keep talking about it, keep going back, and nothing actually shifts, nothing actually changes in any lasting way, this video is for you. Robert was a tax attorney, 57 years old. He was quiet in the way that lawyers sometimes are, not unfriendly, just contained. He chose his words carefully. When he did speak, he used the right word. Not more words than necessary, just the right one. He was good-looking in a quiet way. Nothing flashy. He sat upright, forearms on his knees, jacket folded over the arm of the chair. He had the bearing of someone who had spent his whole career being the calmest person in complicated rooms. And he was proud of that. You could feel it. The calm was not accidental, it was practiced. Annette was 54. She had just retired from teaching high school English. 26 years in the same district. She was warm from the moment she walked in. She smiled when she shook my hand. The real kind of smile, the one that uses your whole face. She talked quickly, the way people do when they are nervous and also when they care very much about being understood. She was wearing a green cardigan, and throughout the session her hand kept finding the cuff of it. Not fidgeting exactly, more like a habit. Her hand went there every time she was about to say something that mattered. They had 3 grown kids. No crisis, no affair, no addiction. No single thing you could point to and say, this is where it broke. Just 28 years, and something that had gone very quiet. They told me the story they'd told the 3 therapists before me. They had communication problems. Robert had difficulty expressing emotion. He said this himself. Annette sometimes escalated too quickly. She said this about herself. They had learned these words in therapy, and they used them now like a script, a polished, well-rehearsed, 8 years in the making script. I get defensive. I over-explain. I shut down. They were fluent in the language of their marriage's problems. They could describe the problems beautifully. I was listening to the script, but I was also watching. And when Annette moved from the script they had rehearsed together into her own actual words, when she started trying to tell me, specifically, concretely, what it was like, she said, "What I think happens is," and Robert exhaled. It was barely anything, just air leaving his chest. Nothing you would notice if you weren't specifically looking. His eyes moved, one quick glance at the clock above my bookshelf, and then his right hand moved to his left sleeve and adjusted the cuff. One small, precise gesture. The whole thing took less than a second. Annette's sentence stopped. She blinked. "Anyway," she said, I don't know. It's hard to explain." And I thought, there it is. Let me stop the story for a second. I want to tell you about something before I go further. Because what I saw in that 10th minute is something I see often. In couples who have been together a long time, in couples who are genuinely trying, in couples who have been to therapists and read the books and done the work. And most of them have no idea it's happening. We talk a lot, in therapy, in popular culture, in the articles people share online, about the big, obvious things that damage a relationship. Lying, cheating, cruelty, screaming at each other. The things that are easy to name, easy to point to, easy to feel. Those things cause real harm. They do. But there is another kind of harm. It is much quieter. And in my experience, it is much harder to treat. Because the person doing it often doesn't know they're doing it. And the person receiving it often can't name why they feel as bad as they do. They just feel it. Something is wrong. They can feel it in their chest, but they can't point to the moment it happened because there was no single moment. There were thousands of them, and each one was barely visible. John Gottman is a researcher who spent decades watching couples in a lab. His team coded thousands of hours of couples talking together. Every gesture, every pause, every shift in posture, every look. And what they found, over all those years of research, was that the couples who eventually split were not always the loudest ones, not always the most obviously miserable ones. The single strongest predictor of a marriage ending, stronger than big fights, stronger than distance, stronger than the presence of any one specific problem, was contempt. Now, when most people hear that word, they picture something dramatic. Sneering, scorn, open disrespect, cruelty with an audience. But that's not what Gottman's findings were pointing at least, not only that. It was also the small kind, the everyday kind, the kind that lives inside a breath, a glance, a tiny shift of a hand that takes less than a second and changes everything. I call it micro-contempt. And what it actually means, in plain words, not clinical ones, is a signal. A tiny, often unconscious signal from one person to the other that says, what you are about to say is not going to be worth my full attention. Not, I hate you. Not, you're an idiot. Not anything that loud or that clear. Just, I already know this isn't going to matter. One fraction of a second. And the other person's sentence dies. Okay, back to Robert and Annette. So I watched it happen once. I filed it. And then Annette tried again. She came back around. She was determined, you could feel her trying. And she said, I think what I'm trying to say is... There it was again. The exhale, the clock, the sleeve. Less than a second. Automatic, like breathing. Annette's sentence stopped again. She looked down at her hands. Then she said, never mind. She had a habit of that. Never mind. Like a little door she closes herself. Because somewhere along the way she had learned to close it before someone else could. By the time it happened a third time, I had been counting. 3 times in 10 minutes. 3 times she had started to say something real. 3 times, before she could get the second sentence out, Robert's body had sent the signal. And 3 times, Annette had stopped. Now here is what I need you to understand. And this is the piece I most want you to hear from this whole story. Robert was not being cruel. He was not trying to shut her down. If you had stopped him in that moment and asked, are you listening? He would have said yes. And he would have meant it. He was sitting right there. He had not interrupted her. He was being what he thought of as patient. In his mind, in his conscious, intentional mind, he was doing everything right. He had absolutely no idea what his body was doing. Let me stop the story again, because there's something here I don't want to go past too fast. We spend so much time in couples therapy and in arguments with our partners talking about intent. What did you mean? What were you trying to do? I didn't mean it that way. That's not what I was trying to say. And we argue about intent for hours, sometimes for years, because intent feels important. It feels like it should matter. If you didn't mean to hurt someone, that should count for something, shouldn't it? Here is what I know from 16 years of doing this work. Intent does not change what the body receives. When Robert's chest moved, when his eyes went to the clock, when his hand went to that sleeve, Annette's nervous system picked it up, not as a thought, as a feeling, as something that landed in her chest before her brain had time to name it. The body is very good at reading signals. It was doing that long before we had language. It reads them fast, and it reads them accurately, and it does not wait for an explanation. She felt the door closing. Every single time. She couldn't always tell you what had happened. She just knew, somewhere in her body, that the space had changed, that the room had gotten smaller, and so she stopped. The fact that Robert didn't mean it does not mean it didn't happen. The fact that he didn't know he was doing it does not mean Annette didn't feel it. Those two things can both be true at the same time. He did not mean to harm her, and he had been harming her for years. They had done this tens of thousands of times. She had stopped finishing sentences. Not all at once, slowly. The big ones first, the things she really needed to say, the things that felt risky, the things she wasn't sure he would receive well. Those went quiet first. Then the medium ones, and over time, without ever deciding to, she had shrunk the things she said down to the size of things she was reasonably sure he might actually wait out. Small things, safe things, things that did not require anything of him, things that did not really need to be said. She had stopped expecting to be fully heard. And because she had stopped expecting it, she had stopped trying for it. And because she had stopped trying, Robert had never been challenged to show up differently. And so, year after year, the pattern had kept itself alive, fed by his signal and her silence, and neither of them knowing, not really, where it had started. What they called a communication problem was actually this. One of them had quietly stopped making room for the other's words, and the other had quietly stopped having words worth making room for. That is not a communication problem. That is what happens when contempt, even small, quiet, unintentional contempt, gets to run unchecked long enough. Now, here is where it gets even more complicated. All three of Robert's previous therapists had worked on communication. They had given him tools, and he had the tools. I feel statements, active listening, reflecting back what Annette said before responding. He was good at the tools, actually. In a session with a therapist watching, he could deploy every one of them correctly. He was a smart man. He had spent his career learning how to perform competence quickly and well. He had mastered the form. But the tools worked on the surface of the problem. And the problem was far underneath the surface. You cannot fix a bruise by putting makeup on it. The bruise is real. It is under the skin. The makeup does not touch it. Robert had learned to speak in the right format during therapy sessions. And the moment he and Annette walked out into the parking lot, his body went back to what it had always done. Because nobody had ever asked him to look at what his body was doing. That is what I decided to do. In session 2, I did not work on how Robert and Annette talked to each other. I did not give them communication exercises. I did not ask them to use the tools they already had. I worked on Robert. Specifically, I asked him to pay attention to something. I asked him to notice. Not stop, not change, just notice. Every time he felt the urge to dismiss something Annette was about to say. Before the exhale happened. Just before it. The moment when his brain or his body or both of them had already decided, here comes something I don't need to fully hear. I gave him no instruction about what to do with it. I was not asking him to correct the behavior. I was asking him to see it. He looked at me like I had given him a very odd assignment. He told me he didn't think he had anything to notice. He was not aware of doing anything. He came back for session 3 and sat down and said, I caught it 4 times. In about a 4-hour stretch on Saturday afternoon. He looked unsettled saying it, like a man who had gone looking for something small and found something large. Let me stop the story one more time, because 4 times in 4 hours is worth sitting with. When one person in a relationship has this pattern, has learned, somewhere along the way, to brace against the other person's words before they've even been spoken, it often runs constantly. Beneath the surface, faster than thought. Most people who have it have had it so long that it feels like the air they breathe. They cannot see it because they have never lived without it. 3 therapists had missed it in Robert. Not because they weren't skilled, not because they weren't paying attention, but because they were doing what most of us do, listening to the words, watching for the obvious things, the raised voice, the eye roll, the sarcastic reply. Those are easy to name. They announce themselves. The thing Robert was doing did not announce itself. I had been specifically watching for it, because I had been specifically watching Annette. I had been watching her sentences die, and when a sentence dies, you start looking for what killed it. Robert came in for session 3 looking different, quieter, somewhere between disturbed and relieved. He said, I didn't know I was doing that. I believed him entirely. And then I asked him something. I want to tell you exactly what I asked, because I think it was the question that opened the whole thing up. I said, When you feel that urge, just before the exhale, just before your hand goes to your sleeve, what is the thought? Not a feeling, the actual thought. Even if it's just a word or a fragment. What is sitting there right at that moment? He didn't answer right away. He looked at me for a long time. And then he said something I was not expecting. He said, I think it's, here we go. Here we go. 3 words. And packed inside those 3 words was the whole story of the marriage. Let me tell you what here we go actually is, because it sounds simple. But it is not simple. It is not cruelty, it is not hate. It is not even dislike, not really. Here we go is exhaustion. It is anticipation. It is the feeling of a person who has already made a decision, before the sentence even starts, about what this conversation is going to be. They have heard this before, or they think they have. Their body has learned to expect a certain kind of exchange, a certain kind of effort, a certain kind of outcome. And so, before any of that can happen, the body braces. And the bracing comes out as a breath, a glance, a small movement of the hand, half a second, and then the sentence across from them stops. Here we go is a prediction. And here is the clinical piece I want you to really sit with. Predictions in relationships, when they run long enough, when they become automatic enough, become self-fulfilling. They make themselves true. When Robert braced, Annette felt the door close. She shortened the thought. She said, never mind. She left the sentence unfinished, and Robert never heard the end of it. He never found out whether what she was about to say was actually, here we go, or whether it was something else, something new, something he had not heard before. He had been predicting the same conversation for 14 years. And in doing so, he had made sure it always ended the same way, early, unfinished, unresolved. The prediction protected itself. In session 4, I asked him where here we go came from. It took him a while to get there. He did not like this kind of territory. He was a precise man who liked answering questions he had answers to. This was not one of those questions. But eventually, he talked about his mother. She was a woman who asked questions she did not want the answers to. She would say, how are you? But if you actually started to tell her, if you started the sentence and kept going, you could feel her leave. Not physically. She was still sitting right there. But she was gone. Her attention had moved. He had learned very young to keep things short, to summarize, to not start a sentence he wasn't sure she would wait out. He had been a child in a house where beginning a sentence felt like a small risk, where getting to the end of a thought was not something you could count on. And he had married Annette, who needed to be heard the long way, who processed her feelings out loud, in full, in real time, going back and looping around and coming at it from 3 different angles before she arrived at what she was actually trying to say, who sometimes needed to say a thing 3 ways before she understood what she meant herself. That was not a character flaw. That is how she thought. That is how she had always thought. And somewhere around year 14 of their marriage, not overnight, not with any single decision, his body had learned to do to Annette exactly what his mother had done to him. He had learned to leave before the sentence was over. He had no idea. In session 4, he cried. He had not cried in a therapist's office in years. He sat for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, I did to her what she did to me. And Annette heard that. She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, not with anger, not with vindication, just with something open in her face. And she reached over and put her hand on his arm. It was the first time in our sessions that either of them had touched the other. What I want you to hear about that moment is this. What broke open in session 4 was not a communication skill. Robert did not learn a new listening technique. Annette did not learn to express herself more efficiently. What happened was something quieter and more important. Robert saw for the first time the shape of what he had been doing, not as something he had chosen, as something he had learned, something that had been handed to him before he was old enough to refuse it. He had carried it into his marriage without knowing he was carrying it. And when he finally saw it, when he could finally hold it in his hands and look at it, something in the room changed. That is not nothing. That is actually very hard to do. Seeing a pattern you have run for 40 years without knowing you were running it, that is genuinely difficult work. Most people avoid it their whole lives. Not because they are bad people, because it requires sitting still in a quiet room and being willing to be surprised by yourself. And most of us, when we are surprised by ourselves, would rather find another explanation. Robert did not find another explanation. He sat with it. And something started to shift. So what does this mean for you? I am going to give you one specific thing to take away from this story. Not a list, not 5 steps, one thing. Because I think one thing you actually do is worth more than 10 things you read and set down. This week, at some point, you are going to be in a conversation with someone you are close to. Your partner, your spouse, someone who matters to you. And at some point in that conversation, maybe early, maybe in the middle, you are going to feel an urge to be somewhere else before they've finished the sentence. It might be very slight. It might feel like impatience. It might feel like boredom. It might feel like nothing specific, just a small pull toward the door. When that happens, I want you to get curious about it. Not ashamed, not defensive, not guilty. Curious. Like a scientist who has just noticed something, ask yourself, what is the word under this urge? What is the thought, not the feeling, the thought, that is sitting there right before I check out? Is it, here we go? Is it, I already know how this ends? Is it something more specific than that? Something about this person, this conversation, this topic? Whatever it is not nothing. It is information. It is telling you something about what you have learned to expect from this person, about what your body has decided somewhere along the way, about whether this exchange is going to be worth it. You don't have to fix it tonight. You don't have to tell your partner about it. You don't have to confess it or apologize for it or figure out where it came from. Not yet. You don't have to do anything with it except see it. Name it. Even just to yourself. Even just in your own head, in your own words. That is how Robert started. He just watched. He just noticed. He caught it 4 times on a Saturday afternoon, and it disturbed him. And that disturbance was the beginning. Because once you can see a thing, you are not entirely inside it anymore. You are slightly outside it. And from slightly outside it, you have choices you did not have before. He did not stop the exhale in session 3 or session 4 or session 5. But by session 6, something shifted. Annette was talking, and she started a sentence. What's been hard for me lately is... And she kept going. She went all the way to the end of it. The whole thought, out loud, to its actual conclusion. No, never mind. No trailing off. She finished it. And I watched Robert's face. He looked surprised. Not at what she said, at himself. At the fact that he was still there, still present, still inside the sentence with her, and the sentence was still going, and he had not looked at the clock. He sat quietly for a moment after she finished, and then he said, "Okay, I'm listening." And he was. I'm going to tell you one more thing before I close this up. If you are the Annette in this story, if you are the person who has learned to say, never mind, who has learned to shorten the thought, to close the door yourself before someone else can close it, I want you to hear something. The silence you learned was not your idea. It was a response. Your body learned to protect you from something. It learned to read the room fast and get small before the room could get smaller for you. And it did its job. Your body was trying to take care of you. But that habit, the one that learned to disappear inside unfinished sentences, is not who you are. It is what you learned. And the things we learn, when we have the right support and enough time and a room that is finally safe enough, can be unlearned. Or at least they can be seen. And when we can see them, we can start to make different choices. You do not have to keep finishing your sentences small. You were not built for that. $40,000, 3 therapists, 8 years. The real problem took 10 minutes to see, because I was watching the right thing. Not what they said. What happened when Annette started to say something true? What I saw was not a communication problem. It was a signal so small, most people in the room would have missed it. One breath. One glance at a clock, one fraction of a second adjustment of a sleeve, repeated every time at the exact moment Annette started to speak. So precise, it had a timing to it, like a reflex, like something his body had been practicing since long before he met her. She had stopped finishing sentences because of that signal, not because she didn't have things to say, because the room had taught her 10,000 times that the things she had to say would not be waited out. That is the real problem in a lot of marriages that look, on the surface, like communication problems. It is not that the words are wrong. It is that one person, without knowing it, without choosing it, has been signaling for years that the other person's words are not quite worth the wait. If you find that signal in your own relationship, give it the attention it deserves. Not blame, not accusation. Attention. Careful, honest, patient attention. That is what changed things for Robert and Annette. Not $40,000, not the Gottman method or EFT or weekend intensives. A quiet room, a specific question, and a man willing to look at the one small thing he had never been willing to look at before. Take care of yourself, and take care with yourself.